Have you ever looked at other people's art and thought, I want nice colors in my art too? But in digital art, there's so many ways to add color, so many layer modes, things to keep track of. It looks so hard to do. I have a solution that requires no fancy layer mode tricks. I'm talking about gradient maps. Gradient maps are so underrated. Not only are gradient maps the fastest way to add color and to quickly change and experiment with the mood of your art, but pro tip, you can use it to quickly fix your values. Why not just use layer modes like multiply or overlay to add color to grayscale? Why start painting from grayscale at all? Painting in grayscale is a good way to check your values, or how light or dark something is when painting. Grayscale is useful because it allows you to group values, a technique used to check if important parts of the painting are readable and which parts stand out or don't stand out enough. In other words, starting from grayscale allows you to improve your values and balance in your composition. It also allows you to study how to paint light more easily without colors to confuse you. Usually the objects in your painting should be able to be distinguished from each other even without any color. And so, starting from grayscale is an easy way to ensure strong values when painting. From tone curves to adding many layers, each with different layer modes on top of each other, there are many functions to add color back to our drawings, both with their pros and cons. Tone curves require you to specifically, know how to use tone curves and subsequently the RGB color space, which is more than a little intimidating for newcomers. The next option is layer modes. For example, overlay, multiply, or hard light, vivid light. To add color to grayscale with this, you need to know what these layer modes do and where to utilize them, since they all have different interactions with your painting depending on the colors of the layers below. For example, while multiply does let you add color, it does inevitably darken the painting, while hard light and overlay both can lighten or darken the painting depending on the color you are using and the color you are painting over top. You can't just learn one of these layer modes. You need to know how to use multiple, and undoubtedly, it's a big learning curve if you want to get good colors from grayscale using this method. But when I started digital art, there was one function that both instantly let me color my art and was simple enough for me as a beginner to learn: gradient map. I used this all the time back then. Okay, at that time I wasn't using Clip Studio, it was Photoshop, but many if not all art programs do have this function, including Procreate and IBIS Paint. So I'm going to show you 4 ways, easiest to hardest, I use gradient maps to add colors to my grayscale paintings. No fancy layer modes needed, and no RGB color model needed. The first step is setup, painting in grayscale. The easiest way I found is to do a rough sketch first, and make a layer for each material before alpha locking each layer and painting in the shadows. We can put all our layers we used for the grayscale painting in a folder for easy organization. On Clip Studio, you can then go to Layer, New Correction Layer, Gradient Map. This gradient map layer will affect the color of everything underneath it, and we want to use this because it allows us to click out, work on something, and come back to easily change the colors if we change our minds. In Photoshop, these are called adjustment layers. There's an alternate way to add gradient maps, which you will need to do if you're on Procreate or IBIS, where you duplicate and merge your grayscale folder onto one layer before editing a gradient map directly onto that layer. The downside is that you can't alter your gradient colors after you saved. But if you have your grayscale folder, you can always duplicate and try it again. Just like the name, gradient maps map each part of your painting from light to dark. Add a color on the gradient map and you can see where in the painting the color is placed. More to the left means that it affects the darker part of the image. Let's start with the easiest way to add color, with a high contrast color palette. This is the simplest way to use gradient maps because we're placing it over the entire painting, flattening the tones on the face and pretty much ignoring the values of our original painting. So first we add an off-white and then the main color you want most of your painting to be. We want that main color to be high saturation so that the blush on the face isn't too gray or ashy. We can move these 2 colors to the left until most of the face is simplified to the 2 main tones, the white base and the soft blush. Now we can add the darker colors to the rest of the painting, in this case the clothing, making sure to shift the hue and darken it a little bit each time when adding a new color. Finally, we can add a little bit of a complementary color to bring a little pop to the painting. The complement to my main color blue is orange, so I added that. We can paint over top the base colors we just added to refine the painting. This whole painting is basically a complementary palette, so it's a relatively safe and easy color palette to learn and make. The goal of this color palette is to put as many colors in the shadows as possible while keeping the skin high contrast with 2 tones max. The difference in complexity will lead the eyes to the simplicity of the 2 tones of the face. Let's make it a little more difficult by tinkering with the values first with one gradient map and then layering on another one for the actual color. I do this to more clearly separate the shadows from the areas where the light shines on the object, the highlights. The easiest way to make a more complicated but good color palette is to think of the gradient as warm, cool, warm. When adding the lighter values on the right of the gradient map, so the highlights, you can stick to the warm colors like red, orange, yellow. And then when you get to the midtones or the middle grays, switch to cool colors like green, blue, or purple. And for the darkest part of the shadow, instead of leaving it black, we want it warm again. So pick a saturated but very dark red, orange, or yellow. So the cool colors are sandwiched by the warm colors. And now we can refine and paint over everything yet again. Of course, you can also do the opposite. Cool, warm, cool to have a different effect. But the purpose of this palette is to give the feeling of warm light hitting the object, with cool shadows contrasting that warm light. For these first 2 palettes, we've been doing really high contrast, attention-grabbing colors. But what if you want something softer and you don't like how gray or muddy the skin looks? The goal of this palette is to focus on making the skin look more vibrant. We need to target and specifically select colors we want for specific parts of the painting. So for the skin, making the blush a nice color by taking the main skin color, hue shifting it to either more pink or orange while adding saturation. You can change the undertone of the skin simply by changing the hue of the blush. We want less contrast, so to make the rest of the colors match the already warm skin, if the color you are adding is green or blue, desaturate it to make it more warm toned. The difficulty is a step higher because you need to make sure none of the other colors in the gradient is contaminating the warm colors specifically selected for the skin. The result is a very soft painting, but the skin looks more alive because we paid attention to add more blushy tones. But what if we want even more control with where each color goes? For example, the orange of the skin is also in the hair, and I don't want that. Let's make it harder by introducing masks. This square that we didn't touch at all for the previous gradient maps. Go back in time and make sure your sketch was first painted all with the different materials separated on different layers. For this, it's a little bit different. This time we're not making one gradient map, but adding one gradient map for every different colored material on the painting. So for me, I've got 4. A layer for the skin, the hair, the dark blazer, and one for both the white collar and eye patch. When you first add a mask to your gradient map, the mask is all white, meaning everything on the layer is shown. We can hide everything on the layer by paint bucketing transparency, and then paint on that mask to reveal what was on the layer. Since all of the materials of the grayscale are separated, in Clip Studio, we can select the area we want to color by pressing Ctrl while left-clicking the layer you want to color. Click on the mask and fill your selection, which reveals it on the mask. Then you can click on the gradient attached to that mask and decide what colors you want. This time I'm going all in with a very saturated bright palette with a cool blue light. To make the bright colors match, I'm making sure at least one color is shared between all of the gradient maps, that teal blue light. And now to do the same thing for every single material, and don't forget to color the line art. I'm again painting on top of everything to fix any little details. To make a good, nice, bright palette, there needs to be some parts of the image that are less saturated. So with the many bright colors, I felt that the skin needed to be less saturated, so I clicked on the gradient map and changed the skin color once again to balance out the colors. I simplified and flattened the tones in the hair, so it's basically the opposite of the first few palettes, where the face now has so many hues that the contrast in the detail of the face is what attracts the eye. This last gradient map coloring was pretty easy because the gradient maps I used were correction layers, but in a program where you need to directly edit in the color, you might need a few more steps, like duplicating your original moved grayscale painting a bunch first, adding masks for each material, and then finally changing colors. But here they are. 4 ways to go from grayscale to color using gradient maps. Which of these do you like best? I think the only downside of gradient maps is if you change your vision of your painting halfway while coloring, you can subsequently change the values to the point where the original grayscale is completely lost. But then again, that could also be a pro, because even if you lose value contrast, you can still use contrast in hues to emphasize certain parts. There's a lot more we can do by introducing layer modes on top of gradient maps, but that's for another video. I wanted to keep this with only gradient maps and masks at most so that even if you're new to digital art and you don't know anything about layer modes, you can still do this and get really nice colors while practicing your values. But this looks more complicated than it really is. Thanks for watching. I hope this helps. Okay, see ya!